Good morning, guys. So this week we're going to start talking about Egypt. Before we get into the video, I'm going to go ahead and apologize. I know that my voice probably sounds a little bit weird. I've got a little bit of a cold, so if I sound kind of funny or if the audio quality is different, I apologize. That's my fault. It's because I have a cold. Hopefully it will be better in the next video. It might sound exactly the same, but hopefully it'll be a little bit better sounding. So I'm sorry about that. So today and tomorrow and next week, we're going to be talking about Egypt. Egypt is a big country, and it's also a civilization with a lot of history. There's a lot of stuff that goes on, and a lot of you will be really interested in Egyptian history probably. Normally about half the class is really interested in it because it's fun to learn about. There are a lot of gods and goddesses. They built a lot of things. They're very famous. They're in a lot of movies. They're in the Bible. There are several book series based on Egyptian culture. So there's a lot to learn about. So let's go through and start talking about it a bit. Today we're going to do an overview, and then later on this week we'll do some more in-depth things about specific parts of Egypt. So the first thing we need to know is that Egypt was a civilization from 3100 BC until 32 BC. So that's a huge amount of time. It's one of the first river valley civilizations along the Nile River. So that means that it's one of the first civilizations that was built along the Nile in that river valley. In case you don't know what the Nile is, or you don't remember from when we mentioned it before, the Nile is a river in North Africa that is over 6,437 kilometers long and splits into several different parts. So let's look at a map to kind of get a better idea. So this is a map of the Nile and the two parts we separated into. The Nile splits into a delta and then it goes into the Mediterranean Sea. It splits Egypt into two parts. Usually we call this Upper Egypt. On the map, it's the part that says Nile Delta. And Lower Egypt, so the part that's south of the delta. On the map, it says Lower Egypt. So on this slide, I gave you a map to let you look at it and see. And there are several towns on there that you'll recognize later as we go through and talk. You've probably heard of Cairo before. That's the current capital of Egypt. Maybe you've heard of Memphis before. If you haven't, we're going to talk about it. I think on Wednesday, I think is when it'll be. Giza, that's a place you've probably heard of before. So there's a lot of places in here that you've probably heard before, or you've seen before, or you're going to see and hear about. And then the littler picture is actually a picture of the river, so that you can see what it looks like and get a picture of what this place looks like. Because a lot of times when we think of Africa, we think of deserts. But around the Nile, it's pretty tropical. It's very pretty there. So I've said the word delta a lot, so let's talk about what a delta is in case you've never heard of one before. A delta is the plain at the mouth of a river. So it's an area at the mouth of a river where a river meets and goes into the ocean. In this case, it goes into the Mediterranean Sea. Usually they're really good for farming. Usually a lot of people live around them because it's a good source of water and for farming reasons, and also because we can communicate using rivers and we can use transportation with rivers. So it's usually a really good place to live. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the land of Egypt. So the physical land in Egypt has two different names because it's split into two parts. So the land around the Nile River is called the Black Land. You'll probably remember that when we talked about Mesopotamia, we talked about how there's a lot of flooding in Mesopotamia. So it's called the Black Lands because after a flood, the river makes the soil dark. because there's a lot of nutrients that come out of the river, and also because now the dirt is wet. And we know that when dirt is wet, it's usually a darker color than it was before. So it's called the Blacklands because the dirt gets this almost like black color. You can Google pictures of it and see it. It still happens today. So the other land is the desert. The desert is called the Redlands because if you've ever watched a Western movie, or honestly there are places near here that you can kind of see this kind of red dirt because it's so hot all the time. So the dirt is this red orangey color, and it's that way just because it doesn't rain a lot. Sometimes here in Puerto, the dirt starts to get like this really dark reddish color when it hasn't rained in a few months. Imagine living in a place where it almost never rains. The dirt is this deep red color, so they call it the Redlands. I know those are super creative, very, very creative on the Egyptians' part, but that's what they called them. So the Redlands are kind of self-explanatory. We know what a desert is. We know that it's really hard to live in a desert, and we know that there probably weren't a lot of people living there. But let's talk a little bit about the Blacklands, because that's where most of the civilizations are and most of the stuff we're going to talk about. So I want to give you a little bit of information about them. This area is perfect for farming because it's really close to the river. The soil is really good because of the flooding. So it's a great place to farm. And farming, being successful, means that you have extra food. And it also means that you have well-fed people. So the people there are usually really strong. They're not hungry. They are able to do the things that they need to do because they're not constantly worried about food. They're also able to build a better civilization because if you're always worried about food and making sure that your family is fed and has the things they need, you're not worried about things like art and music and astronomy or keeping track of the time or worshiping gods. You're not worried about that kind of stuff because you're thinking, okay, if we don't get this, this, and this done today, we're going to starve to death tomorrow, right? So that's why it's important to know that the people were well fed, because the fact that they don't have to worry about food means that they have time to focus on other things. So one of the things that they did because of the river is they kept accurate recording of a calendar. This is where the 365-day calendar we use today comes from, because they were able to use the river to track months. Their months weren't the same as ours, but they start using this 365-day year because tides can help us understand how the earth is moving. That's more of a geography thing than an ancient civilizations thing. But the movement of the earth impacts the water on earth. And so they could track days, times, and numbers according to the river. Because they could say every year these things happen at this time, and we know because this is when the river does this. We know that it's the flooding season because the river floods. We know when the flooding season is going to happen because we can look at the river and see how high it's getting. So that's a way that they kept track of time, and it helped create a way for their civilization to keep accurate records and have dates written down. The Nile also gave them a good method of transportation and communication because they were able to take things that they made in the top of Egypt and ship them down the river to the bottom part of Egypt. They were also able to communicate with each other faster because if you're walking on the bank of a river, so on the beach, and I'm in a boat going downstream with the current, I'm going to be faster than you because the river is faster than people can walk. Sorry about my voice cracking. I'm very conscious of it doing it. So that's some things that they used the river for. It's part of the reason living in the Blacklands was significant. All right, so the gods. I'm going to go ahead and apologize because I know that I'm going to pronounce these wrong. Because I've heard them said before, and I know that I'm going to say them wrong because I just struggle to say them. So I'm sorry if you know how to say them. They have hundreds of gods and goddesses. A lot of their goddesses were really powerful. This is really significant for an ancient civilization in Mesopotamia. Because we talked about, when we talked about Babylon, how usually the civilizations here were patriarchal. So that means that men were in control, men were the most important, men were the priests and things, men were the leaders. Egypt is going to be really different from that. We're going to talk about a few of the leaders of Egypt, and you're going to notice that not all of the leaders of Egypt that are important are men. And there are a lot of them that we believed were men until more recent times when we started doing research about them and using modern technology, and we found out that some of the pharaohs were women, and we've always thought that they were men because in Mesopotamia men were usually more important. But in Egypt, a lot of their goddesses were super powerful and really, really important. They played huge roles in their religion, and there were priestesses, so women priests, who were in charge of different temples for different goddesses. So that's something that to us doesn't seem super significant, but it's so important for these cultures because it means that Egypt was different. So a few that are really significant, and that if you look into Egyptian history, you see these for a lot. Obviously, they're not the only ones, and there are other ones who have similar jobs. But these are three that are really, four that are really important and show up a lot. So Hapi, the god of the Nile; Amon-Ra, the king of the gods; Isis is how I was always taught to say it, but now I read that and always want to say Isis. She's the god of healing. She is the goddess of motherhood and a lot of other things. But healing and motherhood are the two that she's most famous for. And Osiris, he's the husband of Isis, and he's the god of the afterworld. He's also known to be a judge. So when you die, he judges you and decides what happens to you after you die. We'll probably talk more about their beliefs about the afterlife later because they're fascinating and they're really interesting. And I want us to talk a little bit about their religion to understand it. And I think a lot of you will like it. So we'll probably talk more about them later, and I will practice saying their names more. Maybe we'll watch a video where someone else says them so you can hear someone say them correctly. So we're going to get into talking about kings. But the first thing we need to know before we move on is what dynasty means. Dynasty is a word you're going to hear in Egyptian history, in some parts of African history, and it's really important in Asian history. But we start seeing it here in Egypt. So a dynasty is a succession of rulers from the same family. So think of the royal family in England right now. We all know who they are. They've been the same family for years. So like the current princes, their dad was supposed to be king. And his mom and dad were the king and queen. And their parents were the king and queen. And their parents were the king and queen. And their parents were the king and queen. And it goes on and on and on and on. It's always the same family. That's what a dynasty is. Just means that the same family is ruling for a long time. So like, if I was the queen, that would mean that my mom and dad had been king and queen, and that one of their parents had been king and queen, and that one of their parents had been king and queen. So that's what a dynasty is, to help it make a little bit more sense. So the rulers of Egypt, they ruled 31 dynasties over 3,000 years. So that over 3,000 years, there were 31 families that were in charge of Egypt. We divide Egyptian history into 3 periods to make it easier to understand. Because 3,000 years is a really long time. So the 3 periods we break it up into are the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So we'll talk about them later on this week. So a pharaoh is the title given to ancient Egyptian kings. So a pharaoh ruled Egypt with absolute power. Whatever he decided was the law. So like no matter what he said, that was the law and you couldn't do anything to change it. Pharaohs were considered to be so powerful that they were also considered gods. So one of the reasons that Egyptians have so many gods and goddesses is because every single king was treated like he was a god. A lot of times we find them recorded in places that they were writing down gods and goddesses. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we start talking about individual pharaohs, individual gods and goddesses, that kind of thing. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on Egypt just because it has such a big history and also because so much of it will probably be interesting to you. I've been paying attention to the things that you guys tell me you're interested in and that you're curious about, so that when we talk about something like this one, we can talk about the stuff that maybe you're interested in. So we're going to spend a little bit of time hopefully talking about their religion and talking about individual kings and queens and talking about the things that they build and the things that they made. Because a lot of the stuff that the Egyptians made are still here today. And there's a lot of their religion and a lot of their stories and things that we still know about today. So Egypt is really fun to talk about. So that's all I have for you today. Our next video will be a video about the Old Kingdom and probably the Middle Kingdom because they kind of overlap in time. So we'll probably talk about them both together. So I will talk to you guys next time, and hopefully my voice will sound a little bit better.